Welcome to English Storytime Adventures. In today's video, we're going to listen to an exciting short story that will help you improve your English skills. Listen carefully and follow along with the subtitles. Before we begin, here are some key words you'll hear in the story. Pay attention to their meaning and try to use them in your own sentences later. Surge, a sudden, powerful forward or upward movement. Physical, relating to the body, tangible or material things. Justify, to show or prove to be right or reasonable. Score, to achieve or gain something, especially a point in a game or competition. Now that you're familiar with these words, let's begin the story. The courtroom was filled with tension. 12 people sat around a long wooden table, each one deep in thought. They were the jury, responsible for deciding the fate of a man accused of robbery. The man, John Turner, sat outside the room waiting for their verdict. He had claimed his innocence, but now the jury had to decide if they believed him. Samantha, one of the jurors, could feel a surge of anxiety in her chest. This was her first time on a jury, and she didn't expect it to be so intense. The evidence presented during the trial had been conflicting, and she wasn't sure if she could justify a guilty verdict. She glanced around the room at the other jurors, wondering what they were thinking. Mark, an older man with graying hair, spoke first. "I think the evidence is strong enough. The security footage shows someone wearing a hoodie just like Turner was on the day of the robbery. It's hard to ignore that." "But the footage wasn't clear," Samantha argued. "How can we be sure it was him? The face wasn't visible, and plenty of people wear hoodies. I don't think that alone is enough to justify sending someone to prison." Several of the jurors nodded, and Mark frowned, but didn't push further. The conversation moved on to the physical evidence found at the scene. A footprint near the broken window. The police had measured the footprint and compared it to Turner's shoes, but the results weren't conclusive. "It could be anyone's shoe," said Emily, a young juror sitting across from Samantha. "The footprint didn't match his shoes perfectly. Plus, there wasn't any DNA evidence linking him to the scene. We can't convict him based on that." The group debated back and forth for what felt like hours. Samantha watched as the emotions in the room began to shift. Some of the jurors, like Mark, were leaning toward guilty, while others, like Emily, weren't so sure. They all knew they had to reach a unanimous decision, but it wasn't going to be easy. The more they talked, the more Samantha's doubts grew. She knew the case was serious. John Turner's life would be changed forever if they convicted him. She didn't want to make the wrong decision, but she also couldn't ignore the facts presented during the trial. The prosecution had built a solid case, and Turner's defense hadn't been able to provide strong enough evidence to clear his name. Suddenly, the foreman of the jury, a tall man named Jacob, spoke up. "We need to stop going in circles. Let's take a vote and see where we all stand." The room fell silent as Jacob handed out slips of paper. Each juror quickly scribbled down their decision. Samantha's hand trembled as she wrote her vote. Guilty or not guilty. It seemed like such a simple choice, but the weight of it pressed heavily on her. Jacob collected the papers and began reading the results. Guilty, not guilty. Not guilty, guilty. As the votes were read aloud, Samantha's heart raced. It was an even split. 6 guilty, 6 not guilty. "This is getting us nowhere," Mark said, frustration clear in his voice. "We need to focus on the facts, the security footage, the physical evidence, his behavior during the trial. It all points to him being guilty." "But what about reasonable doubt?" Emily countered. The defense didn't have to prove he was innocent, only that there's enough doubt that he might not have done it. I have doubts. Jacob sighed. We can't end this without a unanimous decision. Let's take a break, clear our heads, and come back in 10 minutes. The jurors stood up and left the room one by one, heading into the hallway for a breather. Samantha stayed behind, lost in thought. She knew they couldn't stay there forever. They had to come to a decision. When the jurors returned, Samantha could feel the tension rising again. They all took their seats, and Jacob resumed the discussion. We need to focus on one thing at a time, he said. Let's talk about the security footage again. Mark, you think it's enough to convict? Why? Mark leaned forward, his expression serious. The way he was walking, the way he was dressed, it all matches. He's the same height, the same build. The timing lines up perfectly. He was near the store when it happened, and he can't explain why. Samantha frowned. But there's no clear picture of his face. Should we really convict someone based on a shadowy figure? I don't know if that's enough to justify sending him to prison for years. Jacob nodded. I agree with Samantha. We need to be absolutely sure. The conversation continued, and slowly the jurors' opinions began to shift. Emily, who had been unsure at first, became more convinced of Turner's innocence. Mark, though still certain of his guilt, started to soften his stance. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jacob asked for another vote. This time, the results were different. 10 not guilty, 2 guilty. Samantha exhaled in relief. It seemed like they were getting closer to a consensus. But the 2 remaining jurors, Mark and an older woman named Linda, still weren't convinced. We can't ignore the evidence, Linda said quietly. But I don't want to make a mistake. Samantha understood her hesitation. It was a difficult decision, and the stakes were high. But in the end, they had to do what they thought was right. After another hour of debate, Mark finally spoke. Fine, I'll change my vote. I still think he did it, but there's just enough doubt. Linda nodded slowly, and the final vote was unanimous. John Turner was found not guilty. As the jury left the room, Samantha felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The surge of anxiety that had gripped her throughout the trial was finally fading. She didn't know if they had made the right choice, but she believed they had done their best. The court clerk read the verdict aloud, and Turner's face lit up with emotion. He was free to go. Samantha watched him leave the courtroom, unsure of what the future held for him, but she knew one thing for sure. Being part of a jury was one of the hardest things she had ever done. Great job following along with the story. Now, let's review the key words we learned today. Surge, a sudden, powerful forward or upward movement. Example from the story. Samantha could feel a surge of anxiety in her chest. Physical, relating to the body, tangible or material things. Example from the story. The conversation moved on to the physical evidence found at the scene. Justify, to show or prove to be right or reasonable. Example from the story. I don't think that alone is enough to justify sending someone to prison. Score, to achieve or gain something, especially a point in a game or competition. Example from the story. Jacob collected the papers and began reading the results. Guilty, not guilty, guilty, not guilty. It was an even score. Now, let's check your understanding of the story. See if you can answer these questions. Question 1. What was the main challenge that the jury faced in the story? Question 2. How did the physical evidence contribute to the jury's discussion? Do you think it played a major role in the final vote? Feel free to pause the video and write down your answers in the comments. Great work today! Well done! You've just completed another story with English Storytime Adventures. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more fun and educational stories. And don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts or answers to the questions. I'd love to see how much you've learned. Keep practicing, and I'll see you in the next episode of English Storytime Adventures. Until then, happy learning.